The walls of Pembroke Castle absorbed a sound no human throat should ever produce. January 28, 1457. A raw, guttural shriek tearing through frozen stone. Not the cry of a woman in labor. The howl of a creature being ripped apart alive. Behind a bolted door, a 13-year-old girl was being split open. Her hips were cracking under pressure they were never built to withstand. Blood pooled beneath her faster than the linens could absorb it. This was not a birth. This was a controlled demolition of a child's body in exchange for a political asset. The midwives in that room knew exactly what was happening. The baby was too big. The girl was too young, too narrow, too fragile. None of that mattered. What mattered was pulling a living male heir out of her before she stopped breathing. A boy carrying a thread-thin claim to the English crown. That was the only equation these men cared about solving. They got their boy, and they gutted her to do it. The extraction shattered what was left of her adolescence. Margaret Beaufort would never carry another child. Her body was permanently wrecked. A 13-year-old sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition, and the architects of this horror stood satisfied. They believed they had manufactured a bloodline. They assumed the girl beneath the wreckage was finished, hollowed out, controllable. They could not have been more catastrophically wrong. Because in that room, soaked in her own blood, unable to move, Margaret Beaufort did not break. She calculated. While her body burned, her mind crystallized into something far more dangerous than any of them anticipated. If these men were willing to destroy her flesh to chase a crown, then she would dedicate every breath she had left to seizing it from their hands. She buried her pain in a vault no one would ever access. She turned her suffering into architecture, and she began building. This is not a story about a helpless woman enduring the horrors of medieval England. This is the operational blueprint of one of the most dangerous political minds the world has ever ignored. Margaret Beaufort converted her agony into ammunition. She bent kings to her will. She financed an invisible army of informants and assassins. She dismantled an entire royal dynasty from the shadows without ever gripping a weapon. And when the dust settled, she placed her own son on the throne of England, standing on the bones of every man who underestimated her. Before we go deeper into the darkness of her empire, drop a comment below. Tell me which city and country you are watching from. Take a second to subscribe and support the channel. You are watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. To understand what that blood on the floor of Pembroke Castle truly meant, you need to see the machine that dragged a 13-year-old girl into that room in the first place. England in 1457 was not a functioning kingdom. It was a collapsing empire devouring itself from the inside. The king, Henry VI, suffered catastrophic episodes of total mental shutdown. He would sit motionless on his throne for months at a time, staring at nothing, saliva running down his chin, unable to recognize his own queen or form a single coherent sentence. And when a king becomes a vegetable, the predators circle. The rival houses of Lancaster and York did not wait for permission. They moved. These were not honorable, noble families engaged in a philosophical disagreement about governance. These were armed criminal enterprises waging an open war for control of the national treasury and the legal authority to execute anyone who stood in their way. Margaret Beaufort was born directly into the blast radius of this conflict. Her blood was both her inheritance and her death sentence. She was a direct descendant of King Edward III through the Beaufort line, which meant she carried a faint, legally disputed, but extremely dangerous claim to the English crown. And in 15th century England, a girl with royal blood was not treated as a person. She was treated as territory, a piece of contested land with a pulse. Men did not pursue her with affection. They pursued her with contracts, threats, and armed escorts. Before she turned 9, the king himself had already handed her wardship to a powerful duke who planned to marry her off to his own son and absorb her enormous inherited fortune into his expanding empire. Then the chessboard shifted. The duke was arrested. His plans collapsed, and Margaret was transferred like cargo to a new handler. His name was Edmund Tudor. He was 24 years old. She was 12. Edmund Tudor did not bother with courtship. He was operating under a brutal deadline. If he did not lock down her lands and her bloodline immediately, another warlord would seize her by force. So he did what desperate men in dying dynasties do. He forced himself on the child. He impregnated her without hesitation. This was not an accident. This was protocol. A calculated move inside a system that consumed women like fuel. But Edmund Tudor would never witness what his ambition set in motion. While fighting Yorkist forces in southern Wales, he was captured and thrown into the dungeons of Pembroke Castle. The fortress was a death trap. Overcrowded, stinking of rot, infested with vermin. Within weeks, the bubonic plague ripped through the corridors like a fire through dry timber. Edmund watched the lymph nodes in his neck and groin balloon into swollen black masses that wept fluid. His organs failed one by one. He died choking on his own infected tissue, drenched in fever sweat, leaving behind a 12-year-old pregnant widow stranded deep inside enemy territory with absolutely no protection. Margaret had no choice but to run. She mounted a horse and rode through the Welsh countryside, her body carrying a child that, by every statistical measure of the era, was likely to kill her. She was heading for Pembroke Castle, the stronghold of Edmund's brother, Jasper Tudor. When she arrived, she was gaunt, exhausted, and staring straight into a nightmare that no physician of the age had the tools to prevent. Medieval doctors understood almost nothing about the human body. Their entire framework was built on the ancient theory of the four humors. When Margaret's contractions began in late January 1457, the attendants sealed the windows of her chamber to block what they believed were poisonous vapors drifting in from the outside air. They lit enormous fires, which sucked the oxygen out of the room. They ground herbs into paste and muttered prayers over her convulsing body. None of it addressed the fundamental biological catastrophe unfolding inside her. A 13-year-old pelvis was not designed to deliver a full-term infant. The cartilage splintered. The muscle walls gave way. Margaret screamed for hours as her body was torn apart from the inside, hemorrhaging onto soaked linen that no one could replace fast enough. When the boy was finally wrenched free from the ruins of her body, the devastation was irreversible. Margaret Beaufort would never conceive another child for the rest of her life. The physical destruction alone would have shattered most grown adults. And in the medieval system, a woman who could not produce heirs was a depleted resource. Her only recognized function within the feudal order had been permanently eliminated. This is the precise moment where every history book gets Margaret Beaufort wrong. They assume she withdrew into silent devotion. They look at the portraits painted decades later, the dark religious garments, the downcast eyes, and they project submission onto her. They see a broken woman who found comfort in prayer. Look at what she actually did. The grieving stopped almost immediately. While she lay in that airless room, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the torn tissue inside her to scar shut, something fundamental restructured inside her mind. She saw the entire system laid bare for the first time. She recognized the trap with absolute clarity. If she depended on men, they would use her body as a bargaining chip and discard her the moment she lost value. If she showed even a flicker of vulnerability, the Yorkist armies tearing across England would strip her of every acre she owned, murder her newborn son, and seal her inside a convent to rot. Margaret chose a completely different trajectory. She took total, absolute ownership of her situation. She understood something that most of the armored warlords bleeding out in muddy fields did not. Physical strength was a fraud. Men wrapped in 60 pounds of forged steel were dying of dysentery in ditches across the country. Real power was invisible. It lived in financial ledgers. It lived in land deeds. It lived in the quiet, surgical manipulation of fragile male egos. She began constructing a fortress that no army could breach because it existed entirely inside her mind. The first objective was immediate survival. She was a 14-year-old widow sitting on the largest independent fortune in England. That made her the most valuable target in the country. Under English law, if she failed to secure a husband on her own terms, the crown would assign one for her. She would be auctioned off to whichever lord offered the most political leverage. Margaret refused to be sold. She seized control of the process herself. She surveyed the political landscape with the cold precision of a military strategist and identified a man who could function as a shield. She was not searching for love. She was negotiating a corporate acquisition. She found Henry Stafford. Stafford was the second son of the Duke of Buckingham. He had money, he commanded a private militia, and most critically, he maintained deep connections to the ascending Yorkist establishment. Margaret was Lancaster through and through. Marrying Stafford was an act of strategic disguise. And then she did something almost no teenage girl in the entire 15th century had ever done. She drafted the marriage contract herself. She dictated every clause. She ensured that she retained sole, unrestricted control over the income generated by her estates. She purchased Stafford's military protection for a fraction of her annual revenue and locked the rest away to fund operations that would not bear fruit for decades. She relocated to Stafford's estate at Bourne and immediately began operating not as a wife, but as the chief executive of a growing enterprise. She audited every financial record. She restructured the supply chains. She studied theology, canon law, and the intricate legal mechanisms that governed land ownership in England. She learned exactly how to exploit every loophole in the system to shield her assets from rival lords circling like wolves. She was not managing a household. She was assembling a war chest. Every single decision she made fed one obsessive, singular purpose: the survival and eventual coronation of the boy she had nearly bled to death to bring into existence. Meanwhile, outside the walls of her estate, the country was disintegrating. In 1461, the war between Lancaster and York exploded at the Battle of Towton. It remains the single bloodiest day in the recorded history of the British Isles. The two armies collided during a blinding snowstorm in northern England. The Yorkist archers positioned themselves downwind and launched volley after volley of arrows that shredded the Lancastrian front lines before they could even engage. The hand-to-hand fighting lasted 10 consecutive hours. Men caved in skulls with pole axes and crushed rib cages with war hammers until the snow beneath their feet turned into a thick, dark slurry of frozen blood and mud. When the Lancastrian formation finally shattered, thousands of soldiers fled toward the River Cock. The current was fast, and the water was freezing. Men drowned by the hundreds, their corpses piled so high in the shallows that the Yorkist soldiers used the mound of dead flesh as a bridge to cross the river and continue butchering the survivors on the opposite bank. Edward the Thor, a towering magnetic Yorkist commander, claimed the throne. The Lancastrian cause was obliterated. This catastrophe painted an immediate target on the back of 4-year-old Henry Tudor. He was a child, but he carried the Beaufort bloodline. Edward IV understood the fundamental rule of medieval power. You do not leave rival claimants breathing. The new king dispatched his enforcer, William Herbert, to ride into Wales and rip the boy out of Pembroke Castle by force. Margaret could do nothing to stop it. She was forced to watch from hundreds of miles away as her only son was seized and placed into the custody of the very men who had massacred her allies and dismantled her entire faction. Herbert paid £1,000 for the boy's wardship. Henry was relocated to Raglan Castle, raised alongside Herbert's own children, and systematically conditioned to become a loyal, obedient instrument of the Yorkist regime. Most mothers would have collapsed under the psychological weight of that loss. Margaret converted it into fuel. She used her marriage to Stafford to project an image of total, unwavering loyalty to the Yorkist crown. She attended court functions. She smiled at the men who held her son captive. She paid every tax on time. She bowed to every authority figure who crossed her path. Beneath that performance, she was running a covert operation with terrifying discipline. She used her fortune to bribe castle guards, pay off traveling merchants, and maintain a continuous, secret line of communication with her son. She sent him money. She sent him carefully selected tutors. She sent him letters embedded with coded guidance. She was shaping him, programming him, ensuring that no matter how deep the Yorkist indoctrination went, Henry Tudor never forgot who he was. He never forgot the blood in his veins. He never forgot his claim. For 8 years, she played the role of the compliant, aristocratic wife without a single crack in the mask. Then, in 1469, the tectonic plates beneath English politics shifted violently. Edward IV's most powerful ally, the Earl of Warwick, turned against him. Warwick was called the Kingmaker because he possessed a personal army large enough to challenge the crown itself. He launched a full rebellion, captured Edward IV, and temporarily dragged the catatonic Henry VI back onto the throne. The country descended into chaos overnight. Warlords across England used the confusion to settle old debts with swords. William Herbert, the man who had been holding Margaret's son for nearly a decade, was hauled out of a tent after a minor skirmish and decapitated on the spot. Margaret did not hesitate. She moved with a speed and ruthlessness that stunned everyone around her. She traveled to Wales personally. She walked straight into the power vacuum left by Herbert's execution, reclaimed her son, and brought him back to London. She presented the 14-year-old boy directly to the restored Lancastrian king. It was a calculated display of dominance. She was not reuniting with her child. She was placing a piece on the board. But the window slammed shut almost immediately. Edward IV broke free from captivity, raised a fresh army, and marched on London with terrifying speed. He destroyed the Lancastrian forces at the Battle of Barnet, leaving the Kingmaker's stripped corpse bleeding into the English soil. Weeks later, he annihilated the final remnants of Lancastrian resistance at Tewkesbury. The male bloodline of the House of Lancaster was systematically erased from existence. And the old king, Henry VI, was executed inside the Tower of London. His skull was caved in with a heavy blunt weapon while he knelt in prayer. Everyone was dead. Every male Lancaster with a claim to the throne had been hunted down and exterminated. Everyone except a 14-year-old boy and the mother who refused to let him die. Henry Tudor was now the singular obsession of Yorkist intelligence. He was the last surviving drop of Lancastrian royal blood on the planet. Margaret understood with perfect clarity that Edward IV would send killers. There was no legal shield left, no wardship to negotiate, no political alliance strong enough to guarantee safety. The only option was disappearance. She coordinated an extraction with her brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor. Under the cover of darkness, they rode for the coast, weaving through Yorkist patrol routes with a precision that suggested months of advance planning. They secured passage on a ship and launched into the English Channel, aiming for the safety of the French coast. A storm caught them mid-crossing. The wind pushed them far off course. They washed ashore on the coast of Brittany, a small, fiercely independent duchy perched on the western edge of the European continent. The Duke of Brittany took one look at the boy standing on his beach and understood exactly what the ocean had delivered to him. Henry Tudor was not a refugee. He was a weapon, a living piece of leverage against both England and France. The Duke placed Henry under permanent house arrest inside the fortified walls of Château de l'Hermine. Margaret Beaufort was 28 years old. Her only child was locked inside a foreign fortress across a body of water she could not cross. Her political faction had been exterminated down to the last man. The dynasty that had butchered her family and stolen her son sat unchallenged on the English throne, backed by the most powerful military force on the island. And she was surrounded on every side by informants reporting her movements directly to the crown. Before we look at how she dismantled that entire kingdom from a writing desk inside her country estate, you need to understand the community we are building here. Take a moment. If you are one of us, join the ranks. Below this video, there is a button to join the lineage. This is our channel membership. By joining, you are not just watching history. You become part of the team that ensures these stories are told at the highest level. This inner circle keeps the channel alive. It gives you exclusive access, including early investigations before they go public. Do not just watch from the shadows. Step into them. Help us keep producing the best dark history content on this platform. Join the lineage. Margaret sat alone in her chambers at Bourne. Her husband, Henry Stafford, exhaled with visible relief. He believed the threat had finally passed. He assumed his wife would now settle into the quiet, predictable life of an English noblewoman. He looked at her and saw a woman who had been crushed by forces far beyond her control. He had no idea that Margaret Beaufort had not surrendered a single inch of ground. She had merely entered the longest, most relentless psychological campaign of the entire medieval era. She reached for a quill. She dipped it slowly into the ink, and she began to write. The English Channel in the 15th century was not a body of water. It was a killing field made of salt and wind, unpredictable currents, violent squalls, and freezing temperatures turned every crossing into a coin flip between survival and drowning. For 14 years, this brutal stretch of ocean was the only thing standing between a Yorkist assassination squad and a teenage boy trapped in a foreign cage. Henry Tudor was confined inside the Château de l'Hermine, a heavy stone fortress buried in the Duchy of Brittany. The Duke, who controlled the region, offered the boy a simulation of hospitality. Tutors, warm meals, clean clothing. He also stationed armed guards outside Henry's door every hour of every day. The courtesy was decorative. Henry Tudor was not a guest. He was a hostage with a price tag. The Duke understood that as long as he held the last surviving Lancastrian heir in his basement, the King of England was forced to come to the table and negotiate on Breton terms. Back across the water, Margaret Beaufort did not sit idle and pray for divine intervention. She understood with surgical clarity that hope was a worthless currency. Hope did not purchase loyalty. Hope did not smuggle gold across international borders. She operated from her country estates with the discipline and compartmentalization of a professional intelligence director. She recognized that keeping her son breathing on the other side of the channel required more than maternal devotion. It required infrastructure. She needed a covert network. She needed operatives. She needed a shadow organization capable of moving money, information, and people across hostile territory without detection. And she possessed the single most important resource required to build one: the largest independent fortune in England. She identified two men and recruited them into the core of her operation. The first was Christopher Urswick. Urswick was a priest. In the medieval world, this was not a limitation. It was a superpower. The clergy held an unchallenged monopoly on two critical assets: literacy and unrestricted international travel. A man wearing clerical robes could cross borders, enter foreign courts, and pass through military checkpoints without being searched or questioned. Urswick became Margaret's primary field agent. He memorized encrypted verbal messages that could never be intercepted on paper. He stitched gold coins into the hidden seams of his vestments. He crossed the channel repeatedly, delivering cash, coded instructions, and strategic intelligence directly into Henry Tudor's hands inside the fortress walls. The second recruit was Reginald Bray. Bray was not a soldier. He had never swung a sword in combat. What Bray possessed was something far more lethal in Margaret's theater of operations. He was a financial architect of extraordinary precision. Bray took control of Margaret's sprawling land holdings and transformed them into a revenue engine. He restructured the agricultural operations. He maximized crop output. He collected every penny of rent owed across dozens of estates scattered throughout England. Then he took that river of silver and converted it into a weapon. He constructed a clandestine financial pipeline that moved English currency into Breton hands through a network of merchants, intermediaries, and forged trade receipts. Margaret was not simply sending her son pocket money. She was paying the Duke of Brittany a continuous retainer to keep Henry Tudor alive and out of English custody. She was outbidding the King of England in a silent auction for her own child's survival. Edward IV understood the danger with perfect clarity. He dispatched teams of diplomats to the Breton court carrying chests filled with gold and elaborate promises. He offered the Duke exclusive trade agreements. He dangled military alliances. He swore on his crown that he simply wanted to bring Henry home peacefully and marry the boy to a Yorkist princess. It was a lie wrapped in silk, and Margaret knew it the moment the ambassadors left London. Her intelligence network inside the royal court fed her every detail. She knew who was dispatched, what they carried, and what they were authorized to offer. She encrypted urgent warnings and funneled them across the channel through Urswick. She told Henry to trust absolutely no one inside that fortress. She instructed him that if the Duke ever attempted to put him on a ship bound for England, he was to collapse, fake a seizure, simulate a fever so violent that no guard would risk dragging a dying boy onto a vessel. It saved his life. On one occasion, the Duke of Brittany actually agreed to hand Henry over to the English crown. Yorkist agents arrived at the chateau to physically collect the boy. Henry, following his mother's preloaded instructions to the letter, suddenly dropped to the floor in apparent convulsions, burning with a fabricated fever that left his guards unwilling to move him. The transfer stalled. In the chaos that followed, Urswick materialized with a counteroffer. Fresh gold. Better terms. The Duke reversed his decision. Henry stayed in Brittany. Margaret Beaufort had just outmaneuvered the entire diplomatic apparatus of the English monarchy using nothing but a priest, a bookkeeper, and a chest of coins. But this invisible war demanded flawless cover on her end. Margaret maintained her marriage to Henry Stafford with immaculate precision. Stafford remained a visible, active supporter of the Yorkist crown. He fought in Edward's battles. He bled for the regime. He gave Margaret the single most valuable asset an undercover operative can possess: a credible alibi. But in 1471, the shield cracked and shattered. Stafford's body failed him. A severe illness, likely sweating sickness or acute dysentery, ripped through his system. He deteriorated rapidly and was dead within weeks. Margaret was 28 years old, a widow for the second time, and the legal architecture protecting her collapsed overnight. Without a husband, her enormous fortune was completely exposed. King Edward IV now had the legal authority to force her into a marriage of his choosing, handpicking a Yorkist loyalist who would absorb her wealth, dismantle her network, and neutralize her permanently. She had weeks, possibly days, before the king moved. She scanned the political landscape with cold, mechanical precision. She was not looking for a partner. She was not looking for companionship. She was hunting for a predator powerful enough to deter the crown itself. She found Thomas Stanley. Stanley was the king of man. He controlled massive territories across northern England. He commanded a personal army numbering in the thousands, composed of hardened, battle-tested veterans. He was also recognized by virtually everyone in the kingdom as the single most treacherous political operator alive. Stanley had survived every convulsion of the Wars of the Roses by employing one consistent strategy. He betrayed whoever was losing at the precise moment it benefited him the most. He possessed no ideology, no loyalty, no sentiment. He was pure, distilled opportunism in human form. Margaret approached him with a proposition. She did not offer warmth. She offered a transaction. She presented a prenuptial contract that was a masterwork of legal engineering. She gave Stanley access to the prestige and political gravity of her royal bloodline. In exchange, he provided total military protection and political cover. Stanley reviewed the terms. He accepted. They married. Then Margaret executed the move that cemented her dominance over the arrangement permanently. Shortly after the wedding, she summoned a bishop to their private chambers. In his presence, she swore a formal, binding vow of chastity before God. She declared that she would never share a bed with Thomas Stanley. She was finished serving as a physical instrument for the ambitions of men. In a single ceremony, she secured his army, retained full control of her estates, and permanently revoked his access to her body. Stanley, whose interest in the marriage was entirely strategic, accepted the conditions without protest. Margaret Beaufort had just converted one of the most dangerous warlords in England into a salaried employee operating under a contract she had written herself. Armed with Stanley's political influence, Margaret walked back into the royal court and planted herself at the center of the Yorkist power structure. She secured a position as lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth Woodville. She carried the Queen's ceremonial train at public events. She curtsied to King Edward IV. She sat in the great banquet halls of Westminster Palace, surrounded on all sides by the men who had annihilated her family, stripped her faction to the bone, and imprisoned her son in a foreign dungeon. And she served them wine with steady hands and a perfect smile. For 12 years, she hid in plain sight inside the court of her enemies, watching the Yorkist machine operate from the inside, cataloging every weakness, mapping every fracture line, waiting for the structure to crack. In April 1483, it cracked wide open. Edward IV was an enormous man, 6 feet 4 inches of raw physical presence that had once dominated every battlefield he set foot on. But decades of extreme overconsumption, heavy drinking, and a complete absence of physical discipline had devastated his cardiovascular system from the inside. After a routine fishing trip on the Thames, he caught a chill. The chill escalated into pneumonia. Within 7 days, the most powerful warrior king in English history was a corpse. He left behind a 12-year-old heir. Edward V, a child sitting on a throne, is an open invitation for catastrophe. The boy's uncle, Richard of Gloucester, was appointed Lord Protector. Richard was a scarred, paranoid military veteran who had survived the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. He looked at the Queen's ambitious family. The Woodvilles calculated the probability of his own survival under their influence and decided to strike before they could. Richard intercepted the young king on the road to London. He arrested the boy's Woodville escorts and had them executed without any pretense of legal process. He brought Edward V to the Tower of London under the guise of preparation for his coronation. Weeks later, he sent soldiers to seize the king's younger brother from the Queen's sanctuary and locked him inside the tower as well. The Tower of London was not a residence. It was a military fortress encircled by a moat that ran thick with the sewage of the city. The two princes were placed in the royal apartments. Initially, witnesses reported seeing them playing together in the gardens visible from the outer walls. Then, the sightings grew less frequent. Then the boys were moved deeper into the inner ward, away from public view. Then, they vanished completely. 200 years later, construction workers repairing a staircase inside the tower uncovered a wooden chest buried beneath the stones. Inside were the compressed, shattered skeletons of 2 children. Before we examine how Margaret Beaufort exploited the destruction of these 2 boys to demolish an entire kingdom, you need to arm yourself properly. The specific book used as the primary historical foundation for this investigation is available right now. Click the View Products button on your screen. This volume is a devastating piece of research. It tears away the mythology surrounding the Tudor era and exposes the cold, mechanical reality of 15th century power. It served as the structural backbone of today's story. You need to own it to fully understand the depth of Margaret's operation. While you are there, explore the shelf. We have assembled a collection of immersive relics and dark memorabilia designed to complete your library. Open the shop shelf on your screen. Browse while we continue the descent. Richard III crowned himself king. The country reeled. The Yorkist coalition fractured down the center. Half the nobility rallied behind Richard. The other half recoiled in revulsion at the almost certain murder of 2 innocent children. Margaret Beaufort sat in her chambers and watched the kingdom split apart in front of her. She watched the Woodville family, the former queens and power brokers of England, suddenly reduced to fugitives hiding in church sanctuaries, sobbing over sons they would never see again. Margaret did not shed a single tear. She dispatched Christopher Urswick into the streets of London. Her agent navigated the narrow alleys after dark, evaded Richard's surveillance network, and reached Elizabeth Woodville with a single, devastating proposition. Margaret offered a merger. She proposed that her exiled son, Henry Tudor, would return to England and marry Elizabeth Woodville's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. The strategic brilliance of this move was staggering. By binding Henry to the Yorkist princess, he would instantly absorb the loyalty of every Yorkist lord who despised Richard III. Margaret was fusing the 2 warring bloodlines into a single entity that no faction could oppose. She was merging rival criminal empires into one consolidated syndicate. The grieving queen, stripped of every other option, agreed. The operation shifted into active deployment. Margaret activated Reginald Bray. Bray emptied her remaining treasuries. He purchased weapons. He hired professional mercenaries. He distributed gold to disaffected lords scattered across southern England. He coordinated a synchronized multi-front rebellion designed to collapse Richard III's government from the inside and create a landing zone for Henry Tudor's invasion fleet. The public face of this uprising was the Duke of Buckingham. In October 1483, the operation launched. Rebel forces mobilized across the south. Henry Tudor boarded a ship in Brittany and set sail for the English coastline. Margaret sat in her estate, straining for any signal that the plan was working. What reached her was silence, and then rain. A catastrophic storm system parked itself over the British Isles and refused to move. Rivers burst their banks. Roads dissolved into swamps of impassable mud. The rebel columns could not reach each other. The Duke of Buckingham found himself trapped behind the flooded River Severn, with an army of soldiers who had not been paid and had no intention of drowning for a cause that was clearly failing. They abandoned him in the downpour and scattered. Henry Tudor's fleet was caught in the open channel by hurricane-strength winds that shredded his formation and flung his ships in every direction. Henry reached the English coast, surveyed the heavily fortified Yorkist garrisons lining the shore, and made the only rational decision available. He turned his ships around and sailed back to Brittany. The rebellion disintegrated. Richard III responded with savage efficiency. His forces captured the Duke of Buckingham cowering in a drainage ditch. Richard denied him any form of trial. He ordered the Duke dragged to a public square in Salisbury and forced onto his knees over a wooden block. The executioner's blade came down in a single clean arc and separated his head from his spine. Richard's intelligence apparatus went to work on the survivors. They applied pressure. They fractured bones on the rack. They crushed fingers in iron devices until the screaming men gave up every name they knew. The financial trail emerged from the wreckage of the interrogations. The money, the weapons purchases, the mercenary contracts. Every line of evidence pointed to a single origin. King Richard III looked at the quiet, devout woman who had been carrying his predecessor's queen's train for over a decade and finally understood what she was. He drafted an Act of Attainder against Margaret Beaufort. It was the most extreme legal instrument available to the English crown. It annihilated her titles. It confiscated every acre of land she owned. It seized her entire accumulated fortune in a single stroke. But then Richard paused. He looked north. Thomas Stanley sat in his northern stronghold with 3,000 armed soldiers under his direct command. If Richard executed Margaret, Stanley would launch an immediate revolt that would tear open an entirely new front in an already unstable kingdom. The king made a calculation that would ultimately destroy him. He compromised. He transferred the legal ownership of all Margaret's confiscated wealth into Stanley's name. He ordered Stanley to place his wife under permanent house arrest in a remote, isolated castle. She was forbidden from sending or receiving any correspondence. She was banned from entertaining any visitors. She was legally deleted from English political life. Richard believed he had severed the nerve center of the conspiracy. He believed that isolation and confinement would finally break the woman who had been undermining his power from the shadows. What he failed to understand was that Margaret Beaufort had spent her entire existence confined in rooms controlled by violent, powerful men. Physical restriction was not a weapon that worked on her. It never had. The damage was already done. The alliance between Lancaster and York had been forged in secret and could not be unforged. The gold had already been distributed. The mercenaries had already been contracted. The board was already set for the final move. She sat alone in the cold stone chamber of her imprisonment. She looked at the heavy oak door bolted shut from the outside, and she smiled. The heavy oak door sealed shut behind her, but it did not sever a single thread of her network. King Richard III made the critical error of assuming that physical confinement equaled operational neutrality. He fundamentally misread the infrastructure Margaret Beaufort had spent 2 decades engineering. This was not a syndicate that required her physical presence to function. It was a decentralized machine with redundant channels, backup couriers, and compartmentalized cells that could operate independently for months without direct contact. Richard compounded his mistake by handing her custody to the one man on Earth least likely to enforce her imprisonment, Lord Stanley. Stanley was a warlord who measured every relationship in transactional value. He understood with perfect clarity that the mind locked inside that room was the single most valuable strategic asset in the kingdom. He confined her to his remote northern estates in name only. In practice, he turned his back and let her operate. Reginald Bray never stopped working. The pipeline of English silver continued flowing across the channel without interruption. Margaret's couriers simply adapted. They abandoned their old routes and embedded themselves inside merchant caravans and diplomatic convoys crossing into the continent. They carried instructions encrypted in ciphers that no Yorkist intelligence officer had the training to decode. On the far side of the channel, the situation was shifting dangerously. The Duke of Brittany, Henry Tudor's reluctant protector, fell gravely ill. His mind deteriorated. Control of Breton policy slipped into the hands of his treasurer, a man with no loyalty to the exiled prince and a keen appetite for Yorkist gold. Behind closed doors, the treasurer finalized a secret arrangement to deliver Henry Tudor directly into the hands of Richard's assassination team. Margaret's network detected the conspiracy before the agreement was even signed. A whisper intercepted at court, a bribed clerk, a single coded message fired across the water at maximum speed. Henry received the warning with hours to spare. The Breton guards were already assembling outside his quarters when he moved. He stripped off his noble clothing, disguised himself as a common household servant, scaled the fortress wall in the dark, and stole a horse from the stables. He rode at a dead sprint toward the French border, covering ground that should have taken a full day in a matter of hours. He crossed into the territory of King Charles VIII with barely 60 minutes between him and the Yorkist agents pursuing him. They reached the border crossing just in time to watch his silhouette vanish into the dense tree line on the French side. The young French king looked at the exhausted fugitive standing in his court and immediately recognized the opportunity. Henry Tudor was a cheap, precision-guided weapon that could be aimed directly at the English crown. Charles VIII granted him a formal audience. Henry, shaped by decades of his mother's coded letters and strategic conditioning, performed the role flawlessly. He promised France a cooperative, non-threatening neighbor on the other side of the channel if they provided the resources to put him on the throne. Charles opened his armories. He assembled a fleet. He allocated 2 million francs. He supplied a core strike force of hardened French mercenaries, supplemented by Scottish exiles, with their own grievances against the English crown. The confirmation Margaret had waited 28 years to receive finally crossed the channel. The invasion was fully funded. The fleet was being assembled at the port of Harfleur. The final phase was operational. On August 7, 1485, the ships dropped anchor in Mill Bay, a remote cove carved into the rugged southwestern coast of Wales. Henry Tudor stepped off the boat and planted his feet on sand he had not touched since he was a terrified child fleeing for his life. He was 28 years old. He possessed zero military experience. He had never commanded a single soldier in combat. He led a ragged column of roughly 2,000 foreign mercenaries into territory controlled by a fortified, entrenched enemy regime. On paper, it was a suicide operation with no viable path to victory. But Henry Tudor did not need to be a battlefield tactician. He carried the operational blueprint his mother had been drafting for nearly 3 decades. He marched under the banner of the Red Dragon of Cadwallader, a deliberate, calculated appeal to Welsh national identity and ancestral loyalty. He did not raid the countryside. He did not terrorize civilians. He paid for every supply, every meal, every horse with French gold, turning his march into an economic stimulus rather than an invasion. As his column pushed north through the Welsh mountains, the local lords watched from their fortifications. They saw the ancient banner, they saw the coin, and they remembered the letters that Margaret Beaufort had been sending them quietly for years. One by one, they drew their swords and fell into Henry's column. By the time he crossed the border into England, his force had doubled in size. King Richard III received the intelligence report at Nottingham Castle and absorbed it with grim satisfaction. He had anticipated this landing, he had prepared for it. He dispatched riders in every direction, activating the full military apparatus of the Yorkist state. The Duke of Norfolk mobilized his forces. The Earl of Northumberland marshaled his northern levies. Richard sent a direct, explicit command to Lord Stanley. "Bring your northern army to the royal encampment, immediately. No delays, no excuses." Stanley responded with calculated ambiguity. He claimed he was suffering from the sweating sickness and could not travel. Richard did not tolerate evasion. He ordered his personal guard to seize Stanley's eldest son, Lord Strange, and hold him under armed watch. The message sent back to the northern warlord was stripped of all diplomatic courtesy. If Stanley failed to appear on the battlefield in defense of the crown, his son's head would be removed from his body and mounted on a spike, the final positions locked into place. 3 separate armies converged on a waterlogged plain in Leicestershire, just south of the town of Market Bosworth. The date was August 22nd, 1485. Morning dew clung to the plate armor of 12,000 Yorkist soldiers arrayed across the high ground of Ambion Hill. King Richard III commanded the dominant position. He had heavy artillery. He had ranks of veteran longbowmen. He had the finest armored cavalry on the European continent. Below him, pinned against a stagnant swamp called Redamore Fen, stood Henry Tudor, with roughly 5,000 exhausted men. They were outnumbered. They were outgunned. They were geographically trapped. A third force occupied the northern ridge and did not move. Lord Stanley and his brother, Sir William Stanley, commanded 6,000 fresh, rested troops wearing the red livery of the Stanley household. They joined neither the king nor the rebel. They sat in absolute deliberate silence, watching the opening formations take shape on the field below them. Richard ordered his artillery to open fire. Heavy stone projectiles ripped through the morning fog and detonated into the rebel lines. Earth erupted in columns of dirt and shattered bone. Men were pulverized where they stood by the raw kinetic force of the bombardment. Henry's vanguard commander, the Earl of Oxford, understood instantly that his force could not survive a sustained barrage from that elevation. He ordered an immediate advance directly into the Yorkist center. The 2 infantry formations collided in the middle of the field, with a sound that carried for miles. It was a suffocating, deafening compression of armored bodies grinding against each other in a space too narrow for maneuver. Men drove the sharpened points of bills and poleaxes into the exposed joints between plates of armor. The grass beneath their feet dissolved into a thick paste of churned mud and fresh blood. Oxford formed his troops into a tight, disciplined wedge and drove it forward with relentless pressure into the Yorkist center. The lines bent. The killing intensified on both sides. Richard watched the carnage from the hilltop. The battle was grinding into a stalemate that favored no one. He looked north. The Stanley army had still not committed. The king recognized with sudden, terrible clarity that passivity was a losing equation. If the stalemate held, Stanley would eventually pick a side, and the odds were not in Richard's favor. He needed to end this war in a single decisive stroke. He needed to kill Henry Tudor personally. Through the smoke and chaos of the battlefield, Richard identified the banner of the Red Dragon. Henry was positioned behind the main infantry engagement, protected by a small cluster of personal bodyguards. The king saw his opening. Richard III slammed his visor down. He ordered his household cavalry into attack formation. 800 armored knights lowered their heavy lances into the charge position. They drove their spurs into the flanks of their war horses. The column surged down the slope of Ambion Hill with the accumulated momentum of 800 armored animals moving at full gallop. The impact on the rebel perimeter was catastrophic. The defensive line did not bend, it vaporized. The kinetic energy of ironclad horses traveling at 20 miles per hour launched men off their feet and into the air like debris in a blast wave. Richard drove his horse directly at Henry Tudor. He shattered his lance through the chest plate of an opposing knight. He drew his battle axe. He carved through the bodyguards with a ferocity that stunned the men around him. He brought his axe down on the skull of Sir William Brandon, Henry's personal standard-bearer. The blade punched through the steel helmet and split the skull beneath it in a single devastating stroke. The Red Dragon banner collapsed face down into the mud. Sir John Cheney, a rebel knight of extraordinary physical size, standing nearly 6 feet 8 inches tall, stepped into the king's path to absorb the charge. Richard swung his axe with enough force to unhorse the giant and send him crashing to the ground. The king was a concentrated engine of lethal violence, cutting through everything between him and his target. He was 50 yards from Henry Tudor, then 40, then 30. The gap was closing with terrifying speed. On the northern ridge, Lord Stanley watched the King of England carve a direct path toward Margaret Beaufort's only son. Stanley held the outcome of the entire war in his hands. He looked down at the king, who held his own son hostage. He calculated. He weighed the threat against the promise. He thought about the vast wealth, the political leverage, the royal bloodline, and the 2 decades of relentless, grinding, unyielding pressure that the woman he had married had applied to reach this exact moment. Margaret had spent years positioning him on this ridge for precisely this decision. She had converted his loyalty into an investment, and the return on that investment had just become undeniable. Stanley gave the order. 3,000 fresh soldiers charged down the ridge at full speed. They did not strike the rebel flank. They crashed directly into the exposed side of King Richard's cavalry column. The trap snapped shut. Richard's charge lost all forward momentum. His war horse, struggling in the soft, waterlogged ground of the marsh, lost its footing and went down. The King of England was hurled from the saddle and thrown face first into the mud. He refused to retreat. He dragged himself upright. He gripped his battle axe with both hands and fought the infantry closing around him on every side. This was no longer a battle. It was a coordinated execution. A halberd swung in a wide, sweeping arc. The heavy blade connected with the back of Richard's head, shearing away the lower section of his helmet and carving off the base of his skull. The impact drove him forward. A second weapon punched into his exposed back. A third thrust penetrated his pelvis. The killing blow came from below, a dagger driven upward through the base of the skull, piercing directly into the brain. The Yorkist army watched their king die in the mud and disintegrated. Soldiers threw down their weapons and ran in every direction across the blood-soaked field. The mercenaries descended on Richard's corpse with professional efficiency. They stripped his armor. They pulled off his clothing. They draped his naked, mutilated body across the back of a pack horse, binding his wrists and ankles like a gutted animal, and paraded him through the streets of Leicester for the public to witness the end of the Yorkist dynasty. The crown of England was discovered lying in a hawthorn bush at the edge of the marsh where the king had fallen. Lord Stanley walked through the trampled, blood-drenched grass, reached down and lifted it from the thorns. He carried it across the field and placed it on the head of Henry Tudor. Miles away, the news reached Margaret Beaufort. She did not weep. She did not collapse. She received the report with the controlled, measured satisfaction of an engineer watching a structure perform exactly as designed under maximum stress. The 13-year-old girl, hemorrhaging on a stone floor in Pembroke Castle, had ceased to exist decades ago. The frightened widow had been buried even longer. What remained was the architect, and the architecture held. Margaret traveled to London. She entered Westminster Abbey. She watched the Archbishop of Canterbury anoint her son as King Henry VII of England. She watched him marry Elizabeth of York, executing the alliance she had negotiated in secret with a grieving queen years earlier. She had fused the two warring dynasties into a single, unchallengeable entity. The Tudor dynasty was born from the wreckage of a civil war that had consumed England for 30 years. She did not retire to a convent. She did not fade into quiet obscurity. The new king pushed an unprecedented act through Parliament. He declared his mother femme sole, granting her the full legal and financial independence of an unmarried man, despite her continuing marriage to Lord Stanley. She was awarded vast estates across the kingdom. She maintained her own private armed retinue. She established a personal court that operated with the authority and ceremony of a royal household. She began signing her correspondence with a new cipher. Margaret R. The R stood for Regina, Queen. She was never formally crowned, but she exercised the absolute, uncontested authority of the throne itself. She audited the kingdom's finances, she endowed universities, she controlled the distribution of patronage and political appointments. She had reverse-engineered the entire system that had been designed to consume her and rebuilt it with herself at the center. Every man who had torn her childhood apart for political gain was dead. They were decomposing in unmarked graves or entombed beneath the floors of forgotten chapels. Margaret Beaufort outlasted every single one of them. She converted trauma into strategy. She converted fear into operational precision. She constructed the most powerful dynasty in English history using a financial ledger, a network of invisible operatives, and a will forged from pure, unbreakable iron. Thank you for watching until the very end. The shadows of history run deep, and it takes a specific kind of mind to walk through them willingly. If this investigation delivered value, hit the subscribe button right now. Like the video. Share it with someone who needs to understand the real mechanics behind the thrones we read about in textbooks. You have just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Do not stop here. There is a video appearing on your screen right now. Click it. Watch it immediately. It is the mandatory next step in your descent into the past. Let the journey continue.